If you look at, massive data sets across fitness trackers, productivity apps, and like gym memberships, a really specific date emerges as the deadliest day of the year for human motivation.
Right, January 14th.
Exactly. January 14th. That is the day the vast majority of our New Year's resolutions they simply die. And it kind of begs the question, like, why do we treat human self-improvement like a smartphone software update?
Yeah, I mean, we basically assume we could just plug ourselves in at midnight on January 1st, hit restart, and, wake up as version 2.0.
Right.
We expect to just boot up with a new diet, a flawless sleep schedule, and optimized productivity. Like, we just assume all our old behavioral bugs are, I don't know, patched out overnight.
But then you actually look at the science of human optimization and you realize human biology does not run on clean code. It is a messy legacy system.
No, absolutely.
And expecting an instant reboot it's exactly why we hit that January 14th wall. So welcome to today's deep dive. We're exploring the science of human optimization.
Yeah, we really want to look at how we actually build habits, hack our physical health, and, make lasting changes without just burning out by week 2.
Because our sources today cover a pretty broad spectrum of that science, we're analyzing a neurological breakdown of the 7-Day Life Modification Framework, plus some clinical longevity data from the UK Biobank.
Right, and we've also got research on Katy Milkman's Fresh Start Effect, a really detailed guide on advanced biohacking diagnostics, and this fascinating study on authenticity and self-control.
Yeah, and we're also weaving in some very practical, structural strategies from Thomas Frank. He's the creator of College Info Geek.
Which I think really grounds the science in, everyday application.
For sure. So I want you, the listener, to just think about your last failed New Year's resolution, or maybe that restrictive diet plan you abandoned, or that ambitious reading goal that just kind of fizzled out.
We've all been there.
Right. Our mission today is to decode exactly why those past attempts failed at a biological level. And, more importantly, how you can wire yourself for guaranteed success. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We always seem to start our self-improvement journeys on a Monday, or like the first of a new month. But why does that initial surge of intense motivation always crash right around that 2-week mark?
Well, to understand the crash, we really had to dissect the launch. That surge of motivation you feel on a Monday is actually a psychological phenomenon. Researcher Katy Milkman coined it the fresh start effect.
The fresh start effect. Okay.
Yeah, so essentially, temporal landmarks, which are, dates that just stand out from the ordinary, monotonous flow of time, they act as psychological fences.
And they basically serve as a boundary line separating who we were from who we intend to be.
They do, yeah. By triggering this process called cognitive cache clearing.
Cognitive cache clearing, like on a computer.
Exactly like that. I mean, in computing, clearing your cache deletes temporary files that are slowing down the system, right? Mm-hmm. Psychologically, a temporal landmark allows you to just stop ruminating on your past mistakes. It creates this mental distance.
Oh, wow.
You basically convince yourself that the person who ate junk food and skipped the gym was the past you. The future you, starting this Monday, is this completely distinct, disciplined entity.
I mean, it feels incredibly empowering in the moment. You get this massive dopamine hit of pure optimism.
You really do.
But the flaw is that, a date on a calendar only changes your psychological motivation. It doesn't actually change your underlying neurobiology, does it?
Not at all.
Wow.
When you initiate a new habit, your brain is forced to rely heavily on the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
That's the seat of executive function. It handles, conscious decision-making and willpower.
And running the prefrontal cortex is metabolically punishing.
Yeah, it consumes a completely disproportionate amount of glucose compared to other brain regions.
It makes me think of, opening a brand new, really heavy 3D gaming app on your smartphone.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right, because if you leave that app running continuously, your battery's going to drain incredibly fast, leaving you with a totally dead phone by noon.
Exactly. And that is essentially ego depletion. You literally burn through your metabolic resources, forcing yourself to adhere to this shiny new routine.
Leaving you with absolutely no cognitive energy to resist temptations later in the day.
Which is exactly why the brain actively resists relying on the prefrontal cortex for very long. The brain's ultimate goal is caloric efficiency. It wants to offload all that heavy processing to the basal ganglia.
And that's a deeper brain structure, right?
Right. It handles automatic, subconscious routines. When a behavior moves to the basal ganglia, it barely requires any metabolic energy at all. But, getting it there requires a biological process called synaptic plasticity.
And just to Define that for our listener. Synaptic plasticity is basically the brain's ability to physically modify its own structure.
Yes.
Like when you repeat an action, the neurons involved in that action fire together. And over time, they literally physically wire together, creating this faster, thicker neural pathway. It's almost like turning a dirt path into a fully paved highway.
But the challenge is the timeline. Building that neural highway takes a lot longer than a week. The research indicates it takes anywhere from 18 to 254 days to form a true habit.
Wow, 254 days.
Yeah, with the average hovering right around 66 days.
Okay, so I'm looking at these statistics from the sources, particularly from digital products, and they have this concept called the 7% retention benchmark.
Oh, yeah. That metric is brutal.
It really is. Basically, if just 7% of people are still doing a habit or using an app on day 7, the industry considers that top-tier performance.
7%. It's crazy.
So given that, and knowing that ego depletion is a biological inevitability, I have to argue that the classic 7-day challenge is just actively toxic. I mean, you are essentially setting up a scenario that guarantees an ego depletion crash before synaptic plasticity can even begin.
Well, I see why you'd call it toxic, given those failure rates. But throwing out short-term sprints entirely kind of misunderstands their actual utility.
Wait, really? How so?
The 7-day sprint shouldn't be viewed as a habit-building tool at all. It's a diagnostic stress test.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you use the 7-day challenge to expose the friction points in your routine. It tells you exactly where your willpower breaks down, so you can then build systems to circumvent that breakdown.
Okay, so if we're shifting from relying on willpower to building systems, we have to talk about error rates. Because a system that demands absolute perfection is really just willpower in disguise.
That is so true. And that brings us to a really cool concept from cognitive science regarding optimal learning. It's a 15.87% error rate.
Or we can just call it the 16% rule to keep it simple.
Let's go with the 16% rule, yeah. Studies show that if your system is too easy and you succeed 100% of the time, the brain just habituates. You lose engagement.
Because it's boring.
Exactly. But if you fail more than 20% of the time, the psychological friction creates excessive cortisol, and that leads to demoralization and ultimately quitting.
So you actually need to fail about 1 out of every 6 days to stay optimally engaged.
You do.
That completely changes the framing of a quote-unquote failed day. It goes from being a catastrophe to like a mathematical necessity for long-term plasticity.
It really reframes the whole process.
And this structural approach made me immediately think of Thomas Frank from College InfoGeek. His entire methodology is just built on systems that can survive failure.
Yeah, Thomas Frank's background really grounds this idea. He started college right in the aftermath of the 2009 financial crash.
Talk about a stressful time to be a student.
Seriously, the fear of graduating into a debt economy with massive debt drove him to completely systematize his life. He actually paid off $15,000 in student debt while taking full-time classes.
And he didn't do it by just gritting his teeth and using his prefrontal cortex all day. He adopted a very specific philosophy, basically saying, I don't feel like it, is a mindset exclusively for amateurs.
Right. Professionals show up daily, even when inspiration is at absolute zero.
But his real genius was in how he engineered his habits to just bypass the need for inspiration altogether.
His reading challenge tactic is a prime example of this kind of engineering. I mean, most people approach a reading habit by tracking outputs or time.
Yeah.
They decide, I'm going to read for 20 minutes.
Which is what everyone does, right?
Yeah, but Frank shifted the metric entirely. He tracked inputs. He set a goal to read 25 pages instead.
And the neurological difference between those two approaches is striking. If your goal is read for 20 minutes, you essentially create an open loop.
Yep.
The brain realizes the reward, which is getting to stop the task, will happen regardless of your actual effort, just as long as the clock is ticking. So you end up daydreaming for 15 of those 20 minutes.
What's fascinating here is how tracking an input physically alters the habit loop. The habit loop relies on a cue, a routine, and a reward.
Okay.
When the requirement is 25 pages, the only way to trigger the dopamine reward of completion is to execute the concrete motor function of actually reading the words.
You completely eliminate the cognitive loophole that allows for the daydreaming.
Exactly. You force the action.
We see this same principle in platforms like Freeletics as well. The sources show they focus heavily on concrete milestones and group accountability to get people through what they identify as the middle dip.
Ah, the dreaded middle dip.
Yeah. It reliably hits around days 4 and 5 of a new challenge. The fresh start effect has totally evaporated, and you are just left staring at the friction of the routine.
At that point, concrete inputs are really the only thing that pull you through. Surviving that middle dip requires recognizing that motivation is completely transient,
Yeah.
but a well-designed input system remains constant.
But here's a philosophical friction point I want to bring up.
Okay, let's hear it.
If we are aggressively systematizing our lives, like tracking inputs, treating failure as a mathematical 16% optimization metric, and forcing ourselves to act like professionals when we feel terrible, are we losing our authentic selves?
That's a huge question.
Because there is a growing narrative out there that this level of intense self-control just turns people into productivity robots.
Well, psychologists have actually been dissecting this very tension. The Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin published a study specifically examining whether self-control is perceived as authentic.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because they documented a phenomenon called the actor-observer asymmetry. And it completely flips how we understand identity and discipline.
It really does. The asymmetry describes how our perception completely changes, depending on whether we are looking at ourselves or looking at someone else.
Right. So give us an example.
Well, when we observe a friend breaking their diet and, say, eating a whole pizza at 2 a.m., we naturally judge those impulsive, undisciplined actions as revealing their true, authentic self.
We assume the impulsive action is reality and their diet was just a fake facade.
Exactly. Yet, when we evaluate our own actions, we view our self-control as our true self. We firmly believe the version of us that eats the salad and hits the gym is the real us.
And if we binge on pizza at 2 a.m., we just write it off as a momentary lapse that doesn't reflect our core identity at all.
Right. It highlights a severe double standard. We afford ourselves the luxury of identifying with our highest aspirations, but we judge others strictly by their biological impulses.
So why do we do that? Why do we give ourselves the grace of tying our true identity to our highest, most disciplined goals, while simultaneously cynically judging our peers by their late-night ego depletion mistakes?
It basically functions as an evolutionary ego protection mechanism. By identifying our true self with our highest goals, we maintain the psychological optimism required to re-engage the prefrontal cortex after we fail.
Oh, I see.
If we genuinely believed our true self was the undisciplined, impulsive version, we would never even attempt a new routine in the first place. The cognitive cache clearing of the fresh start effect actually requires this asymmetric belief to work.
Because our psychological systems demand this delicate balance, like requiring achievable systems and a 16% failure buffer just to keep the basal ganglia engaged, we really have to look at how that maps onto our physical bodies.
Yeah, we have to bridge the mental and the physical.
Right. If the brain requires small, low-friction inputs to build a habit, how small can a biological habit actually be and still yield a tangible, real-world result?
Well, to answer that, we turn to the SPAN model. That stands for sleep, physical activity, and nutrition. And the data validating this comes from massive clinical reviews, including studies out of the UK Biobank and The Lancet.
And these studies were huge, right?
Massive. They analyzed up to 135,000 individuals over an 8-year period.
The microhabit formula they discovered in that data feels almost mathematically impossible until you look at the biology.
It's shocking.
They found that adding just 5 extra minutes of sleep a night, 2 extra minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise a day, and a half cup of vegetables to your daily diet correlates to an entire extra year of healthy life.
Which sounds too good to be true. But to understand why just 2 minutes of vigorous exercise can add a year of life, we have to look at the vascular mechanisms.
Okay, break that down for us.
Even a brief 2-minute spike in heart rate creates shear stress on the inner walls of your blood vessels.
Sheer stress.
Yeah, and this stress basically forces the endothelium to release nitric oxide, which dilates the blood vessels and improves mitochondrial efficiency.
Wow.
It creates this cascade effect that lowers your resting blood pressure for hours afterward, just from 2 minutes.
And the 5 minutes of sleep. Because I know it's not just about, like, resting your eyes.
No, definitely not. 5 minutes is often the exact window the brain needs to complete one final microcycle of glymphatic clearance.
The glymphatic system. That's the brain's waste removal system, right?
Exactly. It literally flushes cerebrospinal fluid through the brain tissues, clearing out neurotoxic waste like amyloid beta proteins. Those accumulate during our waking hours.
So 5 minutes can literally be the difference between storing those toxins or completely clearing them out.
Yes. The threshold for biological benefit is staggeringly low. Though I should mention, the study also identified the point of diminishing returns.
Right, because there's always a cap.
If your goal is maximum benefit, the optimal input is 42 to 103 minutes of exercise a week, combined with consistently getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep. Hitting those specific metrics yields a maximum benefit of 9.35 extra years of life.
Almost a full decade. But let's clarify for the listener, this isn't just about dragging out your lifespan.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the goal is maximizing your health span. Health span refers to the years lived without major chronic disease or debilitating mobility loss.
Right. Living to 95 isn't really the goal if the last 15 years are spent bedridden.
Exactly. Biohacking aims to keep you highly functional well into your 80s and 90s.
And to guarantee that health span, we have to graduate from basic habits to advanced diagnostics. We reviewed a clinical guide from Craft Body Scan for this, and it draws a hard line between the wearables we all use and actual diagnostic imaging.
Yeah, because most of us are walking around with smartwatches tracking our heart rate variability and our sleep architecture, and we think we're fully optimized.
But wearables are really just excellent behavioral reinforcement tools. They exclusively measure surface outputs.
Right. They monitor the downstream effects of your biology, but they cannot detect the silent, structural threats developing internally before those surface metrics even change.
It's basically the difference between looking at the thermostat in your living room to see if the house is warm versus going down into the basement to inspect the foundation for termites.
I love that analogy.
The temperature might be perfectly stable, but the structural integrity of the house is being silently destroyed.
A perfect illustration of that structural check is the coronary artery calcium score, or SHAC. Advanced diagnostic imaging looks inside the arteries for calcified plaque.
And just to be clear on the mechanism here, calcium is not supposed to be in your arteries.
No, it is not.
When your endothelial lining gets microscopic tears from, say, high blood pressure or systemic inflammation, the body sends calcium to act as a sort of emergency spackle to patch those tears.
And that spackle hardens into plaque. A perfect CAC score is 0. If your score is over 100, it indicates an accumulation of calcified plaque that presents a really elevated risk of heart disease.
Meaning it requires medical intervention.
Yes. And here is the terrifying part. You can have a CAC score over 100 while your wearable shows a phenomenal resting heart rate and perfect daily step counts.
That is scary. These scans also track visceral fat, right?
They do. And unlike subcutaneous fat, which sits just under the skin, visceral fat wraps aggressively around your internal organs. It suffocates them and releases inflammatory cytokines.
But the true value of this diagnostic guide is really how it structures these interventions chronologically. It offers a literal roadmap by decade.
Because biology dictates that your strategy must evolve. In your 30s, the priority is establishing a structural baseline.
So getting those numbers early.
Exactly. This is the decade to aggressively build muscle mass because it acts as a glucose sink later in life, and to get baseline scans so you have historical data on what your quote-unquote normal looks like.
And then as you move into your 40s, the strategy shifts toward metabolic preservation. This is typically when silent insulin resistance begins.
Right. So the focus is on tracking metabolic markers and fighting the natural onset of sarcopenia, which is age-related muscle loss.
Then the 50s become the era of aggressive screening. This is when those silent threats materialize into clinical issues.
Annual scans, tracking bone density, and monitoring arterial health are critical here, because the difference between catching a vascular issue at 51 versus 58 is monumental.
Absolutely. And once you hit your 60s and beyond, the data points squarely at functional fitness. It moves away from optimization and into preservation of independence.
The metrics that matter become things like, can you get up off the floor without using your hands? Do you have the balance to prevent a fall?
It's the culmination of decades of systems translating into daily mobility.
It really requires treating your biology with the same systematic, objective rigor that Thomas Frank applied to paying off his debt. You are managing a complex, long-term asset.
So what does this all mean? Let's bring all these threads together for you. You are the architect of your own habits, but you are also bound by human biology.
Yeah, you can't ignore the hardware.
Right. You do not need to attempt a catastrophic, willpower draining software update on your entire life starting this Monday.
Focusing on micro habits like the 2 minutes of sheer stress on your blood vessels or the 5 minutes of lymphatic clearance, that initiates massive biological cascades.
By understanding the metabolic limits of your prefrontal cortex, you can comfortably accept that a 15.87% failure rate isn't a lack of discipline. It's an actual requirement for learning.
You implement input-based systems, so you don't have to rely on transient motivation. And you use objective diagnostics to look at the structural integrity of your health, rather than just relying on the surface data from a watch.
You optimize line by line?
Taking the pressure off the ego and putting the burden on the system is really the only scientifically backed path to sustained optimization.
It is. But before we wrap, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over.
I'm ready.
We discussed the actor-observer asymmetry earlier, right? Where we tie our true identity to our highest goals, even if we are currently failing at them.
Right.
And we spent a lot of time on synaptic plasticity, the fact that the brain physically rewires its architecture based on the actions we repeatedly perform.
The physical transfer of behavior right into the basal ganglia.
Exactly. So if synaptic plasticity means your brain physically alters its structure to match your repeated actions, and you're using systems to force yourself to act like a disciplined professional, even when you don't feel like it. At what point does pretending to be a disciplined person simply make you one at a biological level? Is the old cliche, fake it till you make it, actually a scientifically proven neurological reality?
Wow. It suggests that identity isn't a prerequisite for action. Action is the biological prerequisite for identity.
You are literally building the physical hardware to support the software you want to run. So the next time you feel the urge to initiate version 2.0 of your life, don't just hit restart and expect clean code. Expect the crash, accept the friction, and know that with every forced repetition, your neurons are physically paving the road to becoming a completely different person.